Welcome again to another fun, awesome remote instruction experience. So last time we talked about the market revolution and we covered a really wide range of topics. We went all the way from 1815 to roughly 1860. Today we're going to look in general at American politics, and we're primarily going to focus on the years 1824, the election of 1824 through the presidential election of 1840. Now, what this is all about is basically the realities of the aftermath of the War of 1812 and what the War of 1812 showed Americans. Now, the things that Thomas Jefferson did not want to have happen ended up happening. The war allowed Democratic Republicans to see that they had a lot of flaws with their political thinking, and it made a lot of people start to come around to a lot of the ideas the Federalist Party was talking about. So it showed Democratic Republicans that they needed to change some of their platforms and some of their policies. The main way it does this, and what you see that Democratic Republicans start to support a professionalized army, navy, and the building of fortifications. So right after the War of 1812, starting in 1815, immediately after the war ends, you see a massive push to build coastal fortifications and to build forts. You also see that a lot of Americans now come around to realizing maybe Alexander Hamilton's idea of having a Bank of the United States is a really good idea. So you see that people start to support having a second Bank of the United States, and a second Bank of the United States is actually going to be passed. So basically what's going to happen is in 1816, Congress is going to create the second Bank of the United States on a 20-year charter. Now this is going to become really important for us to remember. So remember, the second Bank of the United States is established in 1816 with a 20-year charter, meaning it is set to expire in the year of 1836. The third thing that it showed Democratic Republicans is maybe having protective tariffs is a good idea. Maybe protecting American industry and trying to get America to actually become more industrial is a positive thing. So what you see is Democratic Republicans start to actually support protective tariffs and taxes on shipping for the very first time. Now, after the War of 1812, what happens is the country enters into a period known as the Era of Good Feelings. What the Era of Good Feelings is it's a period when there are no political parties. So essentially what happens is everybody pretty much joins the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalist Party completely disappears, and so in 1816, James Monroe is elected president. He is almost elected unanimously, but people make sure to vote against him for the purpose of allowing George Washington to be the only unanimously elected president. Now, some things that happened during this era of good feelings is, for one, it's the first time in American politics where there's going to be a really big economic panic, but it doesn't affect the election. Normally when there's a large economic panic, people leave the party who's in charge and they jump over on the next political party to see if they could fix it. So there's a big political panic economic panic that happens in 1819, but people overwhelmingly elect James Monroe as president. This will never happen again. What this shows us is the Panic of 1819 occurs before that market revolution, and people had not yet attached or connected politics with the economy. They didn't see political figures as having a role in that. Now, the era of good feeling is not going to last long. The first reason it's not going to last long is there is going to come up a sectional issue, meaning a division between slave states and free states. So this first issue that comes up is something called the Missouri Compromise. Now, the Missouri Compromise, also known as the Compromise of 1820, is really the first sectional crisis over the efforts of expanding slavery. In 1819, there's an equal number of slave states and free states in the United States. And so basically what happens is when Missouri applies to be a slave state, people really start to freak out, especially in northern states, because they wanted to keep a balance between free states and slave states. So what ends up happening is a man named Henry Clay is going to come up with something called the Missouri Compromise, where he's going to draw a geographical line at the southern boundary of Missouri. This geographical line is called 36 degrees 30 minutes. If you write it out, it's written as 36 with a little degrees symbol, like a degree in a temperature, and then 30 with a little apostrophe behind it. And that little apostrophe means minutes, which is a smaller segment of latitude and longitude. Now what this line is above that line, it says you cannot have slavery, except for the state of Missouri. Missouri can come in as a slave state. Below that line, slavery is allowed. So what this does, the Missouri Compromise allows for a good kind of boundary and a good check to see where slavery can go and where it can't. Now, I realize I don't have a slide on this PowerPoint, and I'm just now realizing there's not a map up here, so I'll create another document so you can actually go in and see this map and see what the 36 degrees 30-minute line looks like. But be sure to check that out in your textbook. Now, another thing that's going to happen here is that when this Missouri Compromise comes to being, people like Thomas Jefferson absolutely lose their minds over it, and they get really scared. Thomas Jefferson says that it's like a fire bell in the night. It awakened me and filled me with terror. I considered it at once the nail of the Union. Basically meaning that this is a terrible thing. You now actually have a geographical line dividing the country. We're going to talk a lot more about the Missouri Compromise as we move forward, as this is going to play a big role in the coming of the Civil War. Because what this is doing is it's deciding how slavery in new states and in territories should be handled. So the Missouri Compromise is the first thing that breaks up the era of good feelings. The second thing that's going to break up the era of good feelings is something called the American system. Now, the American system is created by this man, Henry Clay. Henry Clay is Speaker of the House. He's from the state of Kentucky. And Clay believed that it was the government's responsibility to create opportunity for people. So what he does is the American system comes up with an economic initiative for economic nationalism. Now what that means is it consists of three parts. Clay says that the United States needs a strong national bank. The second thing he says they need is a new protective tariff. And the third thing he wants to support is internal improvements, paid for by the federal government. Now, what internal improvements means is it means the constructions of roads, bridges, canals, railroads, things like transportation. Think when we talked about the transportation revolution. Henry Clay says that those things should be provided for and paid for by the government. If you notice, a lot of Henry Clay's actual American system and his whole political platform is very similar to Alexander Hamilton and his Federalist platform. In many ways, they were very, very similar. The difference is, though, is that Federalists were not thinking about individuals. They were thinking about kind of collective groups, Americans as a whole. Clay, on the other hand, is thinking about individuals. He wants to help individual people get ahead. Now, his plan is going to arouse a lot of intense support, but also bring about intense opposition, a lot of opposition. All right, so now we've kind of settled the things that are going to kind of break up the era of good feelings and bring about the political division again in the United States. Let's look at the election of 1824. Now, in the election of 1824, everybody who was running for president was running under the Democratic-Republican ticket. So basically what this meant is they're all one party. But the problem is that one party had become very divided. Now, one of the first people to throw their name in the hat to run for president in 1824 is a man named William Crawford. William Crawford is from Georgia. He is a very, very important politician from the day. He's an old Republican, so he would have been one of those people who's, thought they were more Jeffersonian than Jefferson. He did not support federal funding. He did not want a Bank of the United States. This is who Thomas Jefferson supported for president in 1824. And Crawford actually is going to visit Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson's going to give him his blessing and say, yes, I support you. The thing about Crawford is he is not extraordinarily popular during the time. Now, another person who's going to throw his name in the hat is a man named John Quincy Adams. Now, this is the son of John Adams. So just keep in mind, make sure if you're going to talk about John QA that you actually mention and include Quincy in there, or at least the Q, because he was very different from his dad. He's from Massachusetts, just like his dad from Boston. He has a lot of experience, especially with diplomacy. Deals a lot with foreign powers. He helped to negotiate a peace treaty between Florida and Spain. He would have been a terrible debater. He was an extraordinarily introverted. He didn't really like dealing with other people. Very reserved. Not really a bright or warm person. Really kind of cuts himself off from everything. He would have been very ill-suited for political life in the 21st century. But for this time period, for his day, he actually was a very, very good politician. Most things kind of are done behind the scenes. At the time when he is running for president, he is Secretary of State. And remember, we said Secretary of State is really kind of a stepping stone now to becoming president. Most people who become president have previously served as Secretary of State. Now, the third candidate for president is a man named Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, his nickname is Old Hickory. He is the military hero from the Battle of New Orleans. He's kind of the big bright spot for America after the War of 1812. He's extremely, extremely popular with the people, and he showed he's extremely tough. If you can tell in this painting, he has a scar right here on his face, right here. Now this scar, the way he got it is because when he was a young boy, his parents' home was raided by some British soldiers during the American Revolution, and they were looking for his father. When they asked for where his father was, Jackson refused to speak to him. Ultimately, Jackson spits in their face, and because of that, some British soldiers actually take a sword and cut his face. He's a man who kind of does what he wants to do. No one really knows his political views, but they do know he's a military hero. And so that really kind of put him up high on the totem pole. Now, the thing about Jackson, too, he's not a politician. He's just a military guy. People don't really know a whole lot about him. Now, the fourth person who's going to run is Henry Clay. We've already talked about him being from Kentucky. He's not in the cabinet, but he is Speaker of the House of Representatives. This is going to be very important as we move forward in talking about the election of 1824 because he's going to play a very important role. So just spoiler alert there. He was a strong supporter of the War of 1812, and he had very, very strong political principles. People knew what he supported. People knew what he supported. He had the American system. He was very clear in what he wanted. Now, basically what ends up happening is during this election, at the vote, if you'll notice here, is extraordinarily close. Now, if you look at the percentages of how it kind of breaks down, nobody won enough votes to become president. Now, Jackson clearly wins, though, down here, the popular vote. But he doesn't get enough electoral votes to become president. So because he doesn't get enough electoral votes to become president, what happens is it goes to the House of Representatives to decide. Now, under the Constitution, when it's kind of too close to call in an election, you go from the top to vote getters. So basically, of the Electoral College vote. Now, who that is John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Now, remember, this is going to be left up to the House of Representatives to decide who becomes president of the United States. And remember, Henry Clay is Speaker of the House, so he is in charge of the House of Representatives during the election of 1824. Now, what's going to happen is before the House meets to decide who is going to become president after this election, Henry Clay has a closed-door meeting with John Quincy Adams. And this is really remarkable. We don't know what's said here. It's very remarkable because John Quincy Adams kept very detailed diaries and journals. This meeting is completely left out of those. So obviously it wanted to be hush-hush. But we do know what happens at the end of it is Henry Clay is made Secretary of State and John Quincy Adams is selected to be president of the United States. Now, immediately when this happens, Andrew Jackson and his supporters start to yell that this was a corrupt bargain, that this was not fair. And he starts to yell it's not fair because he won the popular vote. He said he was the man of the people and he should have won. Now, once he starts doing that, they start yelling corrupt bargain. Basically what this ends up in is this creates the beginning for the election of 1828. So essentially what happens is during the election of 1824, John Quincy Adams becomes president, Henry Clay becomes Secretary of State, Andrew Jackson is left out to dry, and so his supporters begin already campaigning on his behalf for 1828. Jackson feels very, very, very wronged, and a lot of people were behind him. Now, what ends up happening is in 1828, this is the result 4 years later of who wins. Andrew Jackson overwhelmingly. Now, for the election of 1828, you now have two new political parties. In 1828 is when you see the big split in the party systems again. If you notice, Jackson is running as a Jacksonian Democrat. The name Jacksonian refers to Jackson. This whole age is also known as kind of the age of Jackson. And it's because Jackson was such a controversial and overlarge looming figure that he really kind of becomes the face of this political climate. John Quincy Adams runs as a national Republican, and he tries to say he speaks for the people, but what you see is Jackson wins. Now, once Jackson wins, he returns to a very negative idea of government, and you really see Jackson's true colors once he becomes president. Jackson supported a very small, less active government. He thought people were better off with minimal government control. But Jackson also was not afraid to exercise the veto power. Jackson is going to have some really famous vetoes. For one, in 1830, you're going to see people in Kentucky want a road built from Lexington, Kentucky to Maysville, Kentucky. And it's called the Maysville Road. Maysville, Maysville. You're going to read about it in your primary sources. And he vetoes it because he says, if you want the road, build it yourself. So he is going to veto that. Now, the second thing he is going to veto is going to be the second bank in the United States. So once Jackson is elected in 1828, that really also still kicks off the presidential election for 1832. Now, in 1832, Jackson is going to face off against our friend Henry Clay. So Henry Clay is going to oppose and run against Andrew Jackson. Now, Henry Clay misreads the situation and the political climate in the United States. Henry Clay, in 1832, thinks that most people support the Bank of the United States. And so what he does is he proposes that the Bank of the United States be rechartered early. So remember, the bank is not set to expire until 1836, but he thought, now is a good time to bring it back up. So he's going to move to try to get the Bank of the United States to pass again. It is going to pass in both the House and the Senate. When it goes to Jackson to be signed, Jackson outright vetoes it. Now, what this does is this leads to the people overwhelmingly, again, still supporting Andrew Jackson. So in 1832, you see that Jackson wins again. Now, as you can see, there's two other candidates who run in 1832. For the context of this class, it doesn't really play that big of a role. The main fight was really between the National Republican Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson, your Jacksonian Democrat. Now, what this does is the election of 32 is going to lead to the second party system. Now, remember, we've already talked about the first party system. The end of the first party system is going to come in 1816 with the era of good feelings, when the Federalist Party goes away. The second party system is going to form in 1834. So in 1834, Henry Clay and his supporters are going to form a party called the Whigs. W-H-I-G-S, the Whigs. Now, the name Whig comes from a term that American patriots called themselves during the American Revolution. It's also a British term meaning those who oppose the king. And so the term Whig means, hostility towards the king. It's not really necessarily directly tied to the British Whig Party, but essentially what it is they stood to oppose the king. Now, the reason they chose the term Whig is because many people at this time were calling Andrew Jackson King Andrew I, mainly because he vetoed so many pieces of legislation. And so the American people began to ask, should one person be allowed to stand against the people? Now, the very first political election that you see where the Whigs compete is in the presidential election of 1836. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about this second party system in the next video when we look at what Jacksonian Democrats believed and what Whigs believed. But right now, let's kind of stick to who was a Whig and who was a Democrat during the second party system. So the very first election when you see the Whigs actually competing is going to be in 1836. Now in 1836, a man named Martin Van Buren is going to be the Democratic nominee. He's handpicked by Andrew Jackson to be his successor. And opposing him are 3 different Whig candidates. Now, rather than nominating one unified candidate, the Whigs just nominated people based on kind of geographical locations. So you have Hugh White, who comes from Louisiana. You have Daniel Webster, who comes from Massachusetts, who's a Whig. And then you also have William Henry Harrison from Indiana, who's going to run as a Whig. So there's no national candidate for the Whig Party to choose. Basically, what the Whigs wanted to do in 36 is they wanted to divide and split up the Democratic vote. Now, this is a rather nasty, dirty campaign. There's a really, really rude song the Whigs came up with about Martin Van Buren, which basically compared him to Satan and said that he does whatever Satan wants him to do. And it was just extraordinarily dirty campaign, but negative on all sides. What ends up happening, because the Whig vote is split up, Van Buren is going to win. Now, the issue here with Van Buren winning is once Van Buren wins, the very next year in 1837, there is a massive economic panic. Now remember, when we talked about the Panic of 1819 earlier in this video, we said that it did not affect politics. When the Panic of 1837 hits, however, it does affect politics. By 1837, people had began to associate the economy with the presidency, and so because of that, it's going to negatively affect the next election in 1840. So the next election between 1840, it is ran between Martin Van Buren, the current president of the United States, who won in 36, and the Whigs this time in 1840 are going to select one unified candidate, William Henry Harrison. The reason the Whigs choose Harrison is because he was a very popular war hero, and so they select him to run. This is really kind of considered the first modern political campaign and election, mainly because Harrison is going to actively campaign for president. So the election of 1840 is very modern in that that William Henry Harrison is going to campaign for himself. Traditionally, most people do not campaign for themselves. That was seen as a no-no. Democrats laughed at him. They said he was too old to be president. They referred to him as granny and senile. Whigs kind of use him. They try to say, they make it like he's a log cabin guy. He's a man of the people. Try to make him look like Andrew Jackson, who was also a war hero and seen as a man of the people. As you can see here, he is running a hard cider campaign from his log cabin of giving the people hard cider to drink. And what ends up happening because of the Panic of 1837 is you see the Whigs are going to win their very first election in 1840. So the Whigs win their first election in 1840 and take power. Now, unfortunately for William Henry Harrison, once he takes office in March of 1841, he's going to give the longest recorded presidential inauguration address on the coldest day ever recorded in Washington, D.C. He refuses to wear an overcoat and a jacket or a hat. And so because of this, he is going to get pneumonia, he's going to get very, very sick, and he's going to die within a month in office. So unfortunately, he is not going to be president for long, but he does win in 1840. Once he dies, his vice president, John Tyler from Virginia, then becomes president. And we will talk about that much later. Now, tune in next time and we'll talk and look deeper at what the Whig Party, what their views were, what they thought, who supported the Whigs, and then the Jacksonian Democrats, who supported them and who opposed them. So just remember, the second party system begins in 1834 between the Jacksonian Democrats and the Whig Party. All right, I'll see you next time.